You are listening to the Intelligent Racer Podcast, where we look to educate and entertain the endurance racing community through discussions with racing professionals and elite age groupers.
Today I speak with Pete Kostelnick. Pete is the two-time winner of the Badwater 135, which is a running race in Death Valley, 135 miles in some of the hottest, harshest conditions imaginable. He also recently ran across the United States from San Francisco to New York, 3,100 miles in 42 days, averaging 70 miles a day, smashing the record that was set in 1980. He shares those experiences with us and also shares some tips and tricks on running. I hope you enjoy. Pete, welcome to the podcast today. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. So why don't we start off with your running background? How did you get into running and ultimately start running marathons and then ramped up to the ultra distance?
Yeah, I got into running back in, originally in high school, later on in high school, junior and senior year, I did cross country. And really that kind of came about from, I was never really into running before that, but I really like to hike and hike 14ers in Colorado specifically. And so that was kind of my initial background of wanting to get into running. And then during college, I took several years off and I gained a significant amount of weight. And so that was kind of what spurred me to get back into running my last year of college when I was doing an internship in Washington, D.C. And so that got me, motivated again to run and then really to just drop a few pounds. And then I had the goal of finishing a marathon to see if I could do it and never run again. And I did finish a marathon that fall in 2008. But then when I went back to it for my last semester of college, I met who's now my wife, actually, and she got me into running again. And after she kicked my butt the first time out, literally, I kind of got the competitive itch back. And then from there started getting more serious about marathon running and signing up for more marathons and qualifying for Boston. And then that was kind of the gateway to get more into the more marathons and more of a routine rather than just, I'm going to go run this fall and then not run for a while and really sticking with it. And then from there, I kind of got burnt out on doing marathons. And so then in 2011, that was when I saw all sorts of races out there, just opened my eyes to try, iron distance triathlons and ultra marathons and all sorts of endurance events. And that was kind of the fork in the road for me where I decided, I like triathlons, but I was much better at the ultra marathon concept. And so from there, I just kept signing up for more and more ultra marathons. And each year just kind of got a little crazier from there.
So were there any signs or experiences from your past that told you might be kind of a world-class ultramarathoner?
Not really, because, I'd always been kind of, maybe I guess you could use the word chubby, but, just slightly, bigger than than probably the healthiest weight possible. So now running was never really that, big of a talent of mine. I always argued that, for the guys that were over 160 pounds in my height, and I did pretty well. But, I think I had the mentality, though, for ultra marathons, and that's what intrigued me at first was, my ability to just really do, a task for, hours on end and really just never just kind of getting into a zone. And that was the first thing I immediately noticed about ultra marathons. But as far as being a world-class ultra marathoner, I really didn't have any idea.
So let's focus in on some of the races that you've done. So I would like to talk a little bit about Badwater. And so for those not familiar with that race, it's a 135-mile ultra in Death Valley. Could you just share a little bit about that experience with us? You obviously started out and progressed ultimately to winning it twice and breaking the course record. How did the experience go from the first time you did it, and what lessons did you learn to continue to get better and ultimately win the race?
Yeah, I got in for the first time in 2014, and I was beyond excited. And that was the year where it was actually the alternate course. So it was where they wouldn't allow us to run inside Death Valley National Park. So Yeah, that was a very humbling experience for me. Just being that I was pretty familiar by then with the 100-mile distance, but tacking on another 35 miles, it doesn't, in the grand scheme of things, it just almost, like, oh, it's just another 35 miles, but it's just crazy how far of a distance it ends up being, because especially once you get to that mile 90, you're in a 100-miler, you're like, oh, I got 10 miles left, and this you got almost 50 miles left, and so that, really taught me a lesson, about, how to go about the race, nutritionally and then just psychologically, which led very well into the next year when it was back to the traditional course from Death Valley, the Badwater Basin, below sea level to point to Mount Whitney. And, I think, that race, the first thing I also learned in the first year was you have to have a great crew that really understands you, and I did, and then I kept that very much in the front of my mind going into 2015 and 2016 when I was fortunate enough to come in first place both years, and really, just fine tuning that race strategy over these last couple of years. It's a race I love mostly because it's very mental in a lot of different ways, psychologically, and then also just from a planning and logistics of having a crew rather than aid stations. There's a lot of strategy involved.
So for those not familiar with the race, can you just help visualize some of the challenges of it? Obviously the heat and conditions, and what is the course like? Because like you said, you're starting out below sea level, and then ultimately Mount Whitney is quite a climb. So could you just kind of at a high level walk us through what the experience is like from a course perspective?
Yeah, you start you start at Badwater Basin. There's an argument that the hottest temperature ever was in Libya, but I think the highest actual documented recording of the temperature was actually right there in Badwater Basin. And so it's a place that can get up to 140 degrees. More typically in the summer, it can get up to 120 to 130 pretty commonly. And so you're really dealing with just really extreme temperatures, and not only there, but really throughout the course, because there are 3 climbs of like around 4,000 feet throughout the course, and with the last big one coming at the very end, the last 13 miles is like a straight hike up Mount Whitney. And I say hike because really there's never ever been anyone that's been able to run that whole, or really much of it at all, the last section. And it's just a very grueling race. You have a lot of really long stretches where you can see miles and miles in front of you, which I actually kind of like, but I know that a lot of people, hate to see, how much they have left. And between the climbing and the heat, it's probably one of the most difficult races you can possibly do. And then especially with the timing of the climb up to Mount Whitney at the very end, it's just adds a extra icing on the cake, I guess.
Yeah, it sounds amazingly challenging. So for most of us, we will never be running in Death Valley in that heat, but we do train in heat. So what kind of tactics or lessons have you learned to deal with cramping or dehydration? And you obviously have done it in the ultimate test bed of a desert, but what lessons do you think we could apply across the board for anyone who has to deal with heat? And, for myself, I struggle with it all the time. So, and, I'm dealing with 80, 90 degrees, not 140. So what have you learned from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a lot of making sure that your electrolytes are staying up. And, I take several different supplements an hour in a race like that. There's a couple of Hammer Nutrition supplements I take, along with, I do take S-Caps as well, along with Endurolite Extreme and Endurance Amino and Anti-Fatigue Caps. And so that's kind of my secret weapon, taking those during the race, and then also getting, not eating too many, sugary foods, because, I've tried that in the past, and, a lot of times you'll hit a wall pretty hard at some point if you do those. So I don't do gels. I do gels to a certain extent, but not as much as you would in like a marathon. I eat more of the real foods in a race like that as well, and I think that also helps with cramping, and getting real food down with water has really been a big help to me as well.
Got it. So let's switch gears and talk about your run across America and your 3,100 mile record in 42 days. So on this podcast, earlier episodes, I mentioned that I ran with you with a group of people for the last 6 miles. So on that day, I think you did 80. Was it 87 in your last stretch?
Yep.
Yeah, so you looked as fresh as I could imagine. Maybe it's because you only had 6 miles left, but it was really, really impressive that, I got there and we had 6 miles left and you look like you just started. So, describe for us that last day. I mean, what was that like? So you were, obviously 3,100 miles. You started near San Francisco. You're running on average 70 miles a day. How did it feel to cross that George Washington Bridge and know you're almost close to home?
Yeah, I mean, that last day was very, very challenging early on. Partly because I had more miles than I typically did, because I think 87 was easily the longest day I had on the whole run. But also, I usually would get 8 hours of sleep at night, but going into that last day, I started at midnight rather than at 4 a.m. So I only had a few hours of sleep after I got done with the previous day. So I was very sluggish. Coming out of the gate, I noticed that usually I can hit a 9:30 minute per mile for most of the morning, and that morning I was really sluggish coming out of the gate, more like 11-minute to 12-minute miles, and then a lot of walking mixed in. And I got nervous there because I thought maybe 20 to 30 miles into the day, I might just have to walk, like the last 50 miles all the way to the end because I was just so drained. But it was amazing because once the sun came up, I got a little boost of energy back. I had a friend who ran with me in Ohio, who came all the way out and ran the last 55 with me. So he joined me once the sun was coming up, and that gave me a huge boost of energy. And really throughout the day, my energy just kept getting bigger, kept coming back more and more because I was still mixing in a lot of walk breaks. But once I got to Patterson, New Jersey, and getting close to the George Washington Bridge, I just kind of hit a new level of energy. And really, once I got to George Washington Bridge, I started to see more and more familiar faces. And then I just remember looking over to the right at crossing the George Washington Bridge, seeing the skyline, and just thinking, wow, it was kind of like landing the airplane after a really long flight that was just, rather than being 4 hours, 40 plus days. And it was just incredible to see, all the work that had gone in, just to think back on all the work that had gotten me to that spot.
Yeah, it's amazing. Congratulations. So we'll get into the physical aspects of it in a second, but you mentioned the mental side, which is, most endurance athletes go through these cycles of, peaks and valleys where you get to these dark spots and you're just physically not feeling well. And you ultimately know that those times will go away and things will get better. But how do you deal with those? Do you have any tips or tricks from a mental side to either deal with those dark periods or during your training? Anything you do for the mental strength side of things?
Yeah, I think I think for me it kind of goes both ways when thinking about it, whether it's in training or in a race, or in this case running across the country. When I'm training, I always think about where I want to be and what I want to do, the end goal, and so that kind of gets me. It's kind of like a pulling mechanism to keep me training. And then when I'm actually in the race, and then or running across the country in this case, I kind of use all that training that I did as an investment and kind of as a pushing mechanism rather than a pull mechanism. And I think, okay, I put in all this hard work to get here, so now I'm going to, push through this because, I've been here. I know what it's like even in training, and that's kind of always been my philosophy is let the race down the road pull you to it, and then let the training that you've done push you through it. Really as a good motivator in general.
So like knowing going into whether a race or something like the 3,100 mile run, knowing you've put in all the work already and have confidence in it is essentially what you're saying, right?
Yep, exactly.
So let's talk about the training then. So what exactly was the training like for this 3,100 mile run? I mean, how did you get prepared? And obviously, you did something right to, get to that mental side where you had confidence you were going to be able to do it. And obviously, like, people who run marathons don't run 26 miles before the marathon. You didn't run 3,100 miles before doing this. So what kind of physical training did you do to build up that confidence?
I think it was doing a lot of just really as many miles as I could. I have a normal job, so what I would do is really anytime I had a moment to run this year, I did, and it really came down to waking up at 5 a.m, getting approximately 14 to 16 miles in before work in a couple hours, and then after work doing the same over again, and really trying to get 30 miles in just about every day during the week, and then bumping it up to one long training run each weekend day of 30 to 50 miles to get to 200 miles a week. And that was really all my training consisted of, because I don't really do any cross training. And I think for this, it was really about kind of just putting my legs through hell and getting used to it, and not really taking any days off unless I had to for the 3 months leading up to it.
Right. So you mentioned the 200 miles a week, which is pretty high volume. How did what was your progression like from before the 3,100, but like when you were doing Badwater, or even before that? I mean, you first started out with marathons, and, how did your weekly mileage kind of grow over the years? And how did you know you weren't going too fast to have overtraining injuries and things like that?
Yeah, I think for me, the great thing is that I never really anticipated I would do, compete at Badwater like I have, or run across the country like this. So for me, it's kind of been a progression each year, just looking at each year by itself and never saying, oh, in 5 years from now, I hope to be running 200 miles a week. But yeah, back when I was doing mostly just marathons, I would usually more like in the 50 to 70 mile per week range. And then, each year I kind of just kept increasing my mileage a little bit. Maybe in 2012, I was probably in the upper double digits, and 2013 starting to get close to that triple digits per week, 100 miles. And then 2014 took another step forward, I think more in the lower 100s. And then 2015, more like 150 miles per week. And then this year has been really pretty, I don't think 200 miles per week throughout the year, but pretty close to that, pretty much 150 to 200 miles on average per week, up until the run across the country.
Right. So I've heard you mention in other interviews and things that both the Hocus shoes that you use and treadmill training both helped with keeping your body from being too beat up. So I would really like to explore that, because both of those things are things I think anyone could sort of look into and apply. So why don't we start off with the Hocus? I mean, what are special about those, and why did you feel that was part of the fact that you recovered so quickly each day after those 70 miles? And also, what version of Hocus do you use? Because I want to buy a pair. If they let you run 3,100 miles, maybe they'll let me run, a half marathon or something.
Yeah. I think, I switched to Hocus back in the beginning of, the end of 2014, so about 2 years ago. And that was really where I started to up my mileage from, the lower 100s, peaking out there, and to getting up above 150 to really a point where, I had dealt with a lot of different IT band issues and things like that, and really just a lot of soreness, and when I switched to Hocus, I just feel like some of their models fit me really well, and some don't. But there are some, the Cliftons particularly. The Clifton 3s are exclusively what I wore across the country, and I just love that there's a lot of cushion, yet they're so light. I mean, I'll take them off sometimes and tell someone, all right, mentally guess how heavy this is, and then it's kind of like picking up the empty pop can, when you think it's half full and then it's empty, and you're like, whoa, those are way lighter than I thought they'd be. And they just mold my feet really well too. And so it's, it's kind of like an extension of my foot with a bunch of cushion, and there's a lot of flexibility to the shoe as well that I really like.
Right. And so in terms of the treadmill piece of this, so, a lot of people have that love-hate relationship with treadmills. It's somewhat boring but efficient, especially if you have one in your home or a gym nearby. You did a bunch of training on the treadmill. So how do you deal with the mental aspect of staying stimulated and focused? And also the age-old question of how did you deal with the incline on the treadmill? Do you put it up and kind of simulate hills? Do you keep it flat? Do you keep it at 1%? Just curious, because that's a debate out there, and obviously you've found some success with it.
Yeah, for me, treadmill has always been, I can't run on a treadmill for more than 30 minutes if there's not a TV. So that's the big thing for me, and also have to, obviously have audio plug in as well. But for me, I honestly it's almost as easy for me to do a 50-mile training run on a treadmill as it is outside. And I don't know if that has to do with living in the Midwest or not, but I sometimes when people say, how the heck do you run on a treadmill for 7-8 hours at a time, and I'll tell them, well, how do you sit in front of a TV and watch a show for 7 or 8 hours? And so that's my kind of way of justifying it is it's like I'm, especially with doing the 2-a-days where I do an outside run in the morning and then a treadmill run in the evening. It's kind of my way of just kind of keeping up with everything, and just trying to squeeze as much into the day and catching up on sports, news, and watching shows. It's always been a good way for me to pass the time, and I kind of just zone out and forget that I'm in a gym pretty much in place for that long. But as far as specific training on the treadmill, I do some inclines, but I was noticing that a lot of times when I did extended inclines of more than a couple percent for more than a few miles, then I was developing tendonitis in my feet. So I would caution people, if you're running an incline, don't push it too long, one incline for too long, because you might develop some tendonitis in your arches of your feet. And so I typically put the treadmill at 1% incline, just to make sure that I'm getting a little bit more of a effort than if it's going slightly down, just to make sure it's calibrated.
What did you find harder to do? Race in a race like Badwater, where you've got other participants that are on your tail, either in front of you, behind you. You have a crew that's helping you, or this 3,100 mile race where the only thing you're chasing is a record from 1980, and there's no one around you to sort of, obviously you had people run with you and support you, but there was no competitor with you. I mean, explain to me how you dealt with that, because for some people that would be kind of hard to keep pushing when there really isn't anything or anyone around you, behind you or in front of you.
Yeah, it was, I think it was definitely much more mentally challenging running across the country than a race, because in a race, I mean, exactly, like, there's other people pushing you, you're kind of in the moment, you're really got that fire breathing mentality. But the run across the country, there was, exactly, no one to run with, no one to push you. And, I think one part that really helped with that was that a lot of times I would have runners come out and run with me. And so that was one good way to kind of push me along, even though I wasn't racing them. There were a few days where I had good friends that were really good ultra runners, and I didn't want to let them down by having to walk or go too slow. So that was one thing that kind of kept me motivated on certain days. But, I think one of the things that really kept me going mentally was just knowing that, if I knock these miles out, if I'm efficient, and, every time I need to eat or drink something on the run, just keep walking, don't stop. And so then by the afternoon, I can start to have a little fun with mixing in some more walking if there's enough time. And so that was kind of always my goal, was by 2 or 3 in the afternoon, be able to just kind of cruise in on cruise control at a slower pace or walking, and use that to keep pushing me forward earlier on in the day.
Yeah, I think that's a really good lesson that can be applied across the board, which is keep on moving forward. No matter what race or distance you're dealing with, you're going to have moments where it might be easier to stop or sit down. But if you keep moving forward, you'll feel better and ultimately keep on getting closer to that finish. So that's a good philosophy and helpful. So a couple more questions on the 3,100 miles. Were you ever close to quitting at any point? I mean, how close were you, and how did you deal with that, especially in the early days?
Yeah. I don't think, as far as close to quitting, I was, but close to thinking that my days might be limited for sure, especially early on. There was, going through Yosemite was a lot bigger of a task than I thought it'd be. I was probably silly that I didn't look at the elevation profiles more going into the run, but when I think of Yosemite going into this run, I don't think of 10,000 feet of elevation gain, but really coming from the west, that's exactly kind of how it is. I mean, you're at sea level in San Francisco, and you're even only about 2,000 or 3,000 as you enter into Yosemite. And then by the end of the day, I was hitting 9,000 to 10,000 feet of elevation altitude. So that day in Yosemite really cost me a lot because I developed some really bad tendonitis in my ankle and shins area. And over the next few days, I kind of masked it with some ibuprofen, but that wasn't really doing the job anymore come day 6 and day 7. And so actually on day 7, I took the entire day off, and I was dealing with other things like a lot of chills and teeth chattering and at night from all the sun I was getting during the day. And so that was really a point where, it looked like, there was maybe even a 50-50 chance that, the run would end before I even got to Utah.
One final question on the 3,100 mile run. How was it? What was it like the day after? So when you woke up that day in that, I guess, a hotel or in New York City, did you wake up thinking you had to run and think and kind of feel lost, or were you relieved, or what was that feeling like the day after 42 days of running like this?
Oh, yeah, I did wake, and I wake up probably more during the night than I should, but yeah, there was. Whenever I would wake up or, when I woke up in the morning, it was a little bit of a panic, like, I'm supposed to be somewhere, I'm not supposed to be laying down anymore. And so that was probably the most satisfying night's sleep I got in a while. And, just knowing that, it's taken me a while, I think, mentally to kind of get back into the rhythm of like everyday life, just even simple things like paying bills and getting your mind off of just strictly running and eating. And so it's been definitely a kind of not a challenge, but just very interesting to get back out of the run only mentality.
Yeah, I'm sure. In one way, it's a simpler life, but in another, obviously very challenging. But I could imagine. So what's next? You obviously accomplished, the 3,100 mile record, and you've done some amazing things in ultramarathons. But what do you have your sights on next as a challenge in the running world?
Probably the biggest thing for 2017 will be the World 24-Hour Championships in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Hope to be on Team USA for that in the early July. And then other than that, I'm kind of, I definitely have a itch to get back into racing since I didn't race too much in 2016. So there's a lot of races out there that I'm kind of thinking about, but also going to take the recovery slow since, I am about over a month, after the run across America. I'm still recovering, that's for sure. And so I don't want to push it too hard, but, as soon as I'm able to start racing again, I'd love to work in a bunch of races and get back out there.
Got it. So the 24-hour run, for those not familiar, is you run for 24 hours straight, seeing how far of a distance you can go. So how do you go about mentally attacking something like that that's so different from a point-to-point race?
Yeah, I mean, it's more, it's actually, really, it's probably good for me because I do so much treadmill running at such an even pace that it's really a race all about pace and not really worrying about anyone else but your own race in particular. And it's definitely in my vein of mentality. So I really like the knowing that, how long you're going to be running for really benefits me, because, I'm really someone that likes to kind of just zone in on a pace for a certain amount of time and go from there.
Final question, and then I'll let you go. What is your all-time favorite race venue or location? And I'll even let you throw in there part of your 3,100 mile run if there's a certain state or section, especially if it's New Jersey or New York, since that's from my area. But just kidding. But what is your favorite place to run, other than maybe at home? But is there any special race location or anything that sticks out for you, or looking forward to going back at some point?
Yeah, I really love running in the desert. So, Badwater has a special place in my heart for many reasons. And it's just such a unique atmosphere. But, running through Nevada, if I wasn't in so much pain from what Yosemite did to me, I would have probably loved it even more. But I just love seeing, open road for miles and miles and miles. And, a lot of people hate it, but I just love it. And, that was definitely my favorite place to go for a run.
Excellent. So, Pete, thank you so much for your time today. This has been really interesting. You've done your run across the U.S. has been absolutely amazing and groundbreaking, and we really appreciate you sharing some tips and tricks and things related to that and Badwater and other things. So, again, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Intelligent Racer podcast. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit www.intelligentracer.com. Also, be sure to check us out on social media, and please review us on your podcast directory. Join us next time for another edition of the Intelligent Racer.